Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, settle in, and prepare for another journey into the past. Tonight, we're traveling to ancient Sparta, but not as adult warriors in the phalanx. We're experiencing what it was really like to grow up Spartan, and I promise you, it makes modern military academies look like summer camp. Our journey tonight takes us to Sparta between the 7th and 4th centuries BC, during the height of the agoge, the brutal state education system that transformed children into warriors. This isn't the stylized movie version with abs and slow-motion combat. This is the real experience, the child abandonment, the systematic starvation, the violence as education, and the daily reality that your childhood was designed to break you down and rebuild you as a weapon for the state. Before we begin, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. And if there is another historical topic you'd like us to explore, let me know. Your suggestions help shape these journeys through time. Now let's step into ancient Sparta and discover what really awaited a Spartan child. Your life as a Spartan began with an evaluation that would make any modern parent's blood run cold. You weren't welcomed into the world with celebration and joy. You were inspected like a piece of equipment and judged on whether you met specifications. It was like a quality control inspection, except the product was a newborn baby, and failing inspection meant death. When you were born, you weren't immediately given to your mother for bonding and care. Instead, you were taken to the elders, the gerousia, who examined you under cold scrutiny. They checked for physical deformities, signs of weakness, or anything that suggested you wouldn't become a strong warrior. This wasn't a medical examination for your health. It was an assessment of your military potential before you'd taken your first breath outside the womb. It was like a job interview you couldn't prepare for, held minutes after birth, where failure meant not getting fired, but getting killed. The examination was thorough and merciless. The elders looked at your limbs, your muscle tone, your general appearance. They were evaluating whether the state's investment in raising you would generate adequate return in military service. Spartan society was organized entirely around military power, and every citizen was expected to contribute to that power. A child who seemed unlikely to become a strong warrior was considered a drain on resources. It was economic calculation applied to human infants, where some babies were literally written off as bad investments. If you passed inspection, congratulations, you'd earned the right to attempt survival. If you failed, you were taken to the apotheotai, a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus, and left to die from exposure. This wasn't hidden or shameful. It was state policy, openly practiced and legally sanctioned. The exposure of infants deemed unfit was considered logical. It was like a company eliminating unprofitable divisions, except the divisions were newborn humans, and elimination meant death by exposure. Modern historians debate how frequently infant exposure actually occurred versus how much was Spartan propaganda designed to emphasize their ruthlessness. But even if the practice was less common than ancient sources, the fact that it happened at all, that it was legal and socially acceptable, reveals something chilling about Spartan values. Your worth as a human being was determined entirely by your potential military utility, and that determination was made when you were hours old. If you were female, the inspection was different, but no less harsh. Sparta was unique among Greek city-states in valuing strong women, not for equality, but because strong mothers produced strong warriors. Girls were examined for physical fitness and health. Weak or sickly girls might also be exposed, though possibly less frequently than boys since the military imperative was less immediate. It was like being evaluated for breeding potential, where your value was determined by your ability to eventually produce the next generation of warriors. Assuming you passed inspection, you returned to your mother for early childhood. But don't imagine a warm, nurturing environment. Spartan mothers were famously tough, their maternal instinct channeled entirely toward producing warriors. Tenderness was considered weakness that would soften children who needed to be hard. Your mother's love was expressed through making you strong, not making you happy. It was like having parents whose parenting philosophy, whatever doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. Except they really believed it and actively sought to test that theory. Spartan babies weren't coddled. You were bathed in wine instead of water. The Spartans believed it strengthened you and killed the weak through some kind of trial by alcohol exposure. You weren't swaddled in soft cloths, but wrapped loosely to encourage movement and toughness. You were left to cry rather than immediately comforted, the theory being that immediate comfort produced weak adults. It was like parenting advice from someone who thought infants needed to build character through suffering. Your early diet was designed for utility rather than taste or comfort. Spartan babies were fed whatever made them grow strong, with little concern for whether you enjoyed eating. The concept of picky eater didn't exist. You ate what you were given or you went hungry. And going hungry was considered educational. It was like having parents who'd read every tough love parenting book ever written and decided to implement all of them simultaneously. Even your toys, if you had any, served educational purposes. Spartan children played with miniature weapons, practiced throwing and catching, and engaged in games that built combat-relevant skills. There were no toys just for fun. Everything was preparation for your future role. It was like growing up in a family where every activity was a job training exercise and childhood was viewed as an extended internship for warfare. The Spartan attitude toward crying and pain was particularly brutal. Children were taught from infancy that crying was shameful, that showing pain was weakness, that discomfort should be endured silently. Stories were told of Spartan boys who hid injuries, endured beatings without tears, and chose death over showing weakness. These stories weren't cautionary tales. They were aspirational examples of proper behavior. It was like growing up in a culture where stoicism wasn't a philosophy but a requirement, where showing normal human emotion was considered a character flaw. Your early years were the calm before the storm. Relatively speaking, you lived with your family, though family in Sparta something different than in other Greek cities. Your father was often absent, living in military barracks and visiting only occasionally. Your mother raised you with the explicit understanding that you belonged not to her, but to the state, and her job was preparing you for state service. It was like being raised by parents who saw themselves as contractors for the government, where their job was delivering you to the state in proper condition. Around age 7, everything changed. For boys, this was when the agoge began. The state education system that would dominate the next 13 years of your life. You were taken from your mother, stripped of your childhood identity, and enrolled in a system designed to transform individual children into identical warriors. It was like being sent to boarding school. except the boarding school was a military training program that made boot camp look gentle and lasted over a decade. The separation from your mother wasn't a tearful goodbye with promises to visit. You were taken, and that was it. Your mother was expected to accept this stoically, to take pride that her son was entering the agage, to see this moment not as losing a child, but as fulfilling her duty to produce warriors for Sparta. If she cried or showed distress, she was considered weak and brought shame on herself and her family. It was like a dystopian draft where 7-year-olds were conscripted and mothers who showed normal human emotion were considered traitors. For girls, age 7 brought different but also rigorous education. You weren't sent to the agage, but you entered state-supervised physical training designed to make you a strong potential mother of warriors. Spartan girls received more education and physical training than girls anywhere else in ancient Greece. But this wasn't enlightened feminism. It was pragmatic military breeding program planning. You were being prepared not to be a warrior, but to produce warriors, and that role was taken as seriously as male military training. And so, at 7 years old, your real Spartan education began. Your childhood was officially over. From this moment forward, you belonged entirely to the state, and the state's only interest in you was military utility. Everything that followed was calculated to maximize that utility, regardless of the cost to your well-being, your happiness, or your humanity. Welcome to Sparta, where childhood was a luxury the state couldn't afford, and every child was an investment that would either pay dividends in military power or be considered wasted resources. The agage wasn't a school in any sense we'd recognize today. It was a comprehensive system of physical conditioning, military training, and psychological indoctrination that lasted from age 7 to 20. You weren't learning to read and write. Literacy was considered less important than learning to kill efficiently. You weren't studying philosophy or arts. Those were seen as softening influences that weakened warrior spirit. You were being broken down and rebuilt as a weapon, and the process was designed to be as brutal as necessary to achieve that. You were organized into agilae, herds literally, because Spartans used the same word for groups of boys and groups of animals. This linguistic choice wasn't accidental. You weren't students or pupils. You were livestock being processed into military equipment. Each herd contained boys of similar ages, and you'd remain with this group throughout your training. They were your competition, your support system, and your tormentors all at once. It was like being assigned to a work group, except the work was surviving childhood, and your co-workers were also trying to prove themselves by dominating you. Each herd was supervised by an older youth called an iron, a young man around 20 who had recently completed the agage himself. He wasn't a kindly mentor or supportive teacher. He was your immediate source of discipline, punishment, and judgment. The iron had absolute authority over his herd, and he used that authority liberally. He could beat you for poor performance, for showing weakness, or simply for existing in a way that annoyed him. It was like having a drill sergeant, except the drill sergeant was barely older than you and had recently survived the same abuse he was now inflicting. Above the iron stood the paidonomos, a state official responsible for overseeing all aspects of the agage. This adult held ultimate authority over the education system and could punish anyone, including the iron, for failures. He carried a whip and used it frequently. His job was ensuring that the agage produced proper Spartan warriors, and he pursued that goal with ruthless efficiency. It was like having a school principal whose performance metrics were measured entirely in how many children he could successfully traumatize into becoming soldiers. Your daily routine began before dawn because sleep was considered a weakness that needed to be minimized. You were awakened abruptly and expected to be immediately alert and ready. There was no gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness. You went from sleeping to full physical activity instantly. It was like having an alarm clock that also demanded you immediately do 50 push-ups. Except the alarm clock was a young man with a stick who would hit you if you were slow. Physical training dominated your mornings. You ran long distances, not for fitness, but until you collapsed from exhaustion. You wrestled other boys, learning holds and throws that could break bones. You practiced with weapons, spears, shields, and short swords, using real equipment that could cause real injuries. The training wasn't designed to teach you safely. It was designed to condition you to function through pain, fear, and exhaustion. It was like athletic training, where injuries weren't prevented but encouraged as learning opportunities. The emphasis on wrestling and unarmed combat was particularly brutal. You fought other boys daily, and these fights weren't supervised carefully to prevent injury. Broken bones were common. Lost teeth were expected. Serious injuries that would make modern coaches stop a match were ignored unless they prevented you from continuing. The philosophy was that combat hurt, and learning to fight through pain was more valuable than avoiding pain. It was like boxing without weight classes, rules, or referees who cared about your safety. The phalanx formation was central to your military training. You practiced marching in tight formation, maintaining position despite exhaustion, and moving as a unit rather than as individuals. The phalanx required absolute discipline. One person breaking formation could get everyone killed in actual combat. So the training emphasized group cohesion through shared suffering and punished individual initiative as dangerous deviation. It was like being in a team sport where individual performance didn't matter at all, only group performance, and the group's performance was literally life or death. But the agoge wasn't just physical training, it was comprehensive psychological conditioning, designed to create specific personality traits. You were taught to be laconic, to speak minimally and precisely. The word laconic comes from Laconia, the region Sparta controlled, because Spartans were famous for extreme brevity. Unnecessary words were considered weakness, and boys who talked too much were beaten. It was like growing up in a culture where being verbose was a punishable offense, and communication skills were measured by how few words you used. You were taught absolute obedience to authority. Questioning orders wasn't discouraged. It was unthinkable. When a superior gave an order, you executed it immediately and without discussion. This obedience was enforced through physical punishment, severe enough that questioning authority became psychologically impossible for most boys. It was like military discipline, except applied to children and enforced with violence that would be considered criminal child abuse in any modern context. Endurance of discomfort was elevated to a virtue. You slept on reed mats that you gathered yourself, with no blankets even in winter. The sleeping arrangements were deliberately uncomfortable to toughen you against hardship. You slept in communal rooms with no privacy and minimal shelter from cold. It was like camping, except year-round, with no equipment, in conditions designed to be as uncomfortable as possible without actually killing you. Your clothing was minimal, a single cloak that served as your only garment year-round. No shoes, no undergarments, no seasonal adjustments. In summer, you were hot. In winter, you were cold. This wasn't due to poverty. Sparta wasn't poor. It was deliberate policy to condition you to function regardless of weather. It was like having parents who believed that appropriate clothing was weakness and exposure to elements was character building. Hygiene was minimal and deliberately so. You rarely bathed, your hair was kept short, and grooming was considered vanity unworthy of warriors. You existed in a state of constant physical discomfort, dirty, smelly, cold, or hot, always tired, often in pain. This wasn't neglect, but policy. The belief was that comfortable conditions produced weak warriors, so comfort was systematically denied. It was like living in conditions that would make a modern homeless shelter look luxurious, except by design rather than poverty. The psychological impact of these conditions was profound and intentional. You learned that your physical comfort didn't matter, that your preferences were irrelevant, that your role was to endure whatever the state demanded. Some boys internalized these lessons completely, becoming the hard, emotionless warriors Sparta wanted. Others broke mentally, becoming hollow shells going through motions without real human feeling. A few maintained some core of humanity despite everything, though they had to hide it carefully. It was like psychological conditioning that some might call brainwashing, except it was state policy applied to an entire generation. The competitive pressure within your herd was intense and deliberately cultivated. You competed for food, for slightly better sleeping positions, for the approval of your iron, for everything. The system was designed to make you see other boys as competition rather than allies, to motivate you through rivalry rather than cooperation. It was like being in a workplace that promotes cutthroat competition as company culture, except you were a child and the competition started at age 7. Regular beatings were part of daily life. You were beaten for poor performance in training. You were beaten for showing weakness. You were beaten for failing to steal food successfully. We'll get to that shortly. You were beaten for talking too much, for showing emotion, for any deviation from expected behavior. The beatings weren't abusive outliers. They were standard pedagogy. It was corporal punishment as the primary teaching method, where physical pain was considered the most effective educator. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was that you were taught to view this treatment as normal, even noble. Spartan culture celebrated the hardships of the agoge. Stories were told of boys who endured particularly severe beatings without crying out, who suffered horrific injuries without complaint, who died rather than show weakness. These stories weren't warnings, they were ideals you were expected to emulate. It was like growing up in a cult where the abuse was reframed as enlightenment and suffering was called privilege. And this was just the basic framework of your daily life in the agoge. We haven't even discussed food yet, or the specific trials you'd face, or the ways the system ensured that every moment of every day was calculated to break you down and rebuild you as Sparta needed you to be. Now let's talk about food, or rather, the systematic starvation that Sparta called education. The agoge didn't just provide insufficient food, it deliberately starved you as a teaching tool, as a way to motivate theft, and as a conditioning mechanism to teach you to function while hungry. It was like a nutrition program designed by someone who believed hunger was a pedagogical tool more valuable than actual nutrition. Your daily rations were calculated to be insufficient. This wasn't due to scarcity. Sparta controlled agricultural land and had adequate food supply. The insufficient rations were policy. You were given enough food to survive, but not enough to feel satisfied, not enough to fuel the intense physical training you endured daily, not enough to allow normal growth and development. It was like being on a diet imposed by someone else, where the diet's purpose wasn't health, but teaching you to be constantly hungry. The food itself was the infamous black broth, melasomos, a disgusting mixture of pork, blood, and vinegar that was apparently so awful that even ancient sources from other Greek cities mocked it. One story claims that a foreign visitor tried Spartan black broth and said, "Now I understand why Spartans don't fear death." The broth was nutritionally adequate, but deliberately unpalatable. It was like having institutional food where the institution actively tried to make it taste bad as character building. Meals were communal, eaten in groups under supervision. You didn't have individual portions. You competed with other hungry boys for access to insufficient food. The stronger boys got more. The weaker boys got less. Social hierarchy was reinforced through every meal. It was like a cafeteria where survival of the fittest was actual policy. But here's where the system became particularly twisted. You were expected to steal food to supplement your inadequate rations. Theft wasn't just permitted, it was encouraged as a valuable skill. A warrior needed to be resourceful, needed to live off the land, needed to provide for himself through cleverness. So stealing food was considered educational initiative. It was like having a school where breaking certain rules was part of the curriculum, except the curriculum was theft and the consequence of getting caught was severe. However, and this is crucial, if you got caught stealing, you were beaten savagely, not for stealing, which was expected, but for being caught, which demonstrated inadequate skill. The lesson was clear. Theft was good, but getting caught was failure. You needed to be sneaky enough, clever enough, skilled enough to steal without detection. It was like being graded on criminal activity, where your grade was determined entirely by whether you got away with it. This created a perverse incentive system. You had to steal to avoid starving. But getting caught while stealing resulted in punishment severe enough to make you wish you'd just stayed hungry. So you developed stealth, planning, and cunning, all valuable military skills, motivated by desperation and enforced through violence. It was like a training program, where the training method was systematic creation of desperate circumstances. There's a famous story, possibly apocryphal but culturally revealing, about a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When questioned, he allowed the fox to gnaw through his stomach rather than reveal the theft, eventually dying from his injuries without admitting what he'd done. This story was told not as a tragedy, but as an exemplar of proper Spartan values. Better to die than to admit you were caught stealing. It was a parable where a child's death from stubbornness was celebrated as virtue. The chronic hunger you experienced had significant effects beyond just discomfort. Malnutrition during critical growth years affected physical development. Spartans, despite their military prowess, weren't actually physically larger than other Greeks. Some evidence suggests they were smaller on average. The systematic undernourishment stunted growth, weakened bones, and caused developmental problems that persisted into adulthood. It was like a growth strategy that deliberately stunted growth in the belief that hunger produced better soldiers. The psychological impact of constant hunger was equally significant. You became obsessed with food, thinking about it constantly, planning how to acquire it, taking risks to steal it. This focus on basic survival needs left less mental energy for other considerations, which was perhaps the point. Hungry people are more compliant, less likely to question authority, more focused on immediate concerns than long-term resistance. It was like discovering that totalitarian control could be partially achieved through controlled starvation. Hunger also affected your training performance. You were expected to perform intense physical activities while chronically undernourished. This made everything harder: the running, the fighting, the marching. But that difficulty was considered valuable. The Spartan philosophy held that training under disadvantaged conditions produced warriors who could function under any circumstances. It was like training for a marathon while fasting, based on the theory that if you could run hungry, you'd excel when properly fed. Interestingly, when you finally became a full citizen and joined the Syssitia, the communal dining groups of adult Spartans, the food wasn't much better. You'd graduate from deliberately insufficient rations to adequate but still terrible food. The famous black broth continued to be the staple. Spartan culinary culture was based on the principle that good food made men soft. It was like escaping poverty, only to discover that voluntary poverty was considered virtuous, and you'd be eating terrible food for the rest of your life. The contrast with other Greek city-states was stark. In Athens, even poor families ate better than Spartan warriors. In other cities, food was a pleasure, meals were social occasions, and cuisine was valued. Sparta alone made bad food a point of pride and systematic starvation a teaching tool. It was like discovering one country had decided that suffering was virtuous and made policy accordingly, while everywhere else recognized that feeding people adequately was basic civilization. Some Spartan boys didn't survive the malnutrition. They died from weakness, from diseases their undernourished bodies couldn't fight off, from injuries they couldn't heal from without adequate nutrition. These deaths were considered acceptable losses, the weak weeded out by the system, making the survivors stronger. It was like a filter, where the filter criteria included ability to survive chronic starvation during childhood, and failing the filter meant death. And through all of this hunger, you were training intensely, fighting frequently, enduring cold and discomfort, and expected to maintain performance standards that would challenge well-fed adults. The Spartan system was designed to be nearly impossible to survive, with the survivors emerging as incredibly tough individuals. Tough because they'd survived conditions that killed weaker children. Tough because they'd been hardened by privation that would break most people. Welcome to mealtime in Sparta, where food wasn't nourishment, but another tool for breaking children and rebuilding them as weapons, where hunger was policy rather than poverty, and where the lesson being taught was that your physical needs didn't matter compared to your utility to the state. Beyond the daily brutality of training and systematic starvation, the agog included specific trials and competitions designed to test you in ways that ranged from merely terrible to potentially lethal. These weren't optional activities or occasional events. They were regular occurrences that punctuated your years in the system, each one a test you had to pass to prove your worthiness to continue existing as a Spartan. The most famous, or infamous, was the diamastagosis, the ordeal at the altar of Artemis Orthia. In this ritual, you and other boys attempted to steal cheeses from the altar, while older youths whipped you. This wasn't symbolic whipping. These were real whips that drew real blood. Boys died during this ordeal, bleeding out from the wounds or succumbing to infection afterward. But dying during the diamastagosis was considered dying with honor, proof that you'd endured pain without surrendering. It was like a hazing ritual that sometimes killed participants, and the deaths were celebrated rather than mourned. The goal wasn't actually to get the cheese. It was to demonstrate your ability to endure pain without crying out or stopping. Boys who grabbed cheese quickly and escaped were less praised than boys who endured the whipping longest. The pain was the point. Your ability to suffer without showing weakness was what mattered. It was like a competition where the scoring criteria was how much torture you could endure, and winning meant hurting longest. Tourists from other Greek cities would come to watch the diamastagosis the way modern people might attend a sporting event. They'd place bets on which boys would endure longest, which would cry out first, which would die. Your suffering was literally entertainment for visitors. It was like discovering your most traumatic experiences were tourist attractions, with spectators eating snacks while watching children being whipped. Another regular feature was organized fights between groups of boys. These weren't supervised sparring sessions. They were deliberately chaotic brawls designed to be as close to actual combat as possible without, usually, causing death. You fought with fists, wrestling holds, and whatever else worked. Broken bones were common. Severe injuries were expected. The fights continued until one side was clearly defeated, meaning unable or unwilling to continue fighting. It was like organized street fighting as an educational activity, where the lesson was that violence solved problems and mercy was weakness. These group fights took place on an island in a river, with spectators watching from the banks. Again, your pain was public entertainment. The fights were encouraged to be brutal, with adults watching and evaluating your performance. Showing fear or trying to avoid combat was noted and punished later. You had to fight aggressively, had to demonstrate willingness to hurt and be hurt, had to prove you valued victory over safety. It was like gladiatorial combat for children, minus the weapons, but with the same emphasis on violent spectacle. The crypteia deserves special attention as perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Spartan education. When you reached around age 20, having survived the agoge, you might be selected for this final test. You were sent into the countryside with a knife, told to survive by your own resources, and given a specific mission: kill helots. The helots were enslaved people who farmed Spartan lands, and they vastly outnumbered Spartan citizens. The crypteia served dual purposes. It tested young warriors' ability to survive independently and kill without hesitation, and it terrorized the helot population through random murders. You were expected to hide during the day and hunt helots at night. You chose targets, often the strongest and most capable helots, those who might potentially lead resistance. You killed them silently, efficiently, and without being caught. It was practice in assassination, in treating human beings as targets, in becoming comfortable with murder. It was like a final exam, where the test was committing actual murders of innocent people, and passing required you to kill successfully and escape detection. The crypteia is controversial among historians. Some sources describe it Others don't mention it, and there's debate about how regularly it occurred. But even if it wasn't annual, even if it wasn't required of all young men, the fact that it existed at all reveals something chilling about Spartan values. They created a system where murdering enslaved people was considered educational, where young men proved their worth through assassination of the defenseless. It was terrorism as pedagogy, where the lesson was that Helotlevs had no value, and killing them was acceptable state service. The psychological impact of the cryptia on participants was profound. You returned from killing people who'd done nothing to you, whose only crime was being enslaved by your society. Some young men probably felt nothing. They'd been so thoroughly conditioned by the agage that murder of helots seemed natural. Others likely struggled with what they'd done, carrying guilt or trauma that they'd have to hide because showing such emotions would mark them as weak. It was like discovering that your final graduation requirement was war crimes, and you had to commit them and then pretend they were normal. The treatment of helots throughout your upbringing prepared you for the cryptia. You grew up learning that helots were inferior, dangerous, and numerous, a constant threat that justified their brutal oppression. Young Spartans were sometimes ordered to find and beat helots for minor infractions or for no reason at all. It was like growing up in a society with legally mandated racist violence, where your education included learning to dehumanize and hurt an entire class. Each year, Sparta formally declared war on the helots. This wasn't actual warfare. It was a legal fiction that made killing helots not murder under Spartan law. It was like a society declaring permanent open season on enslaved people, making their deaths legally invisible. This annual declaration of war normalized violence against helots and gave legal cover to the murders committed during cryptia. While we focus on boys' experiences because they're better documented and more extreme, we need to talk about what happened to Spartan girls, whose childhood was also dramatically different from girls in other Greek cities. You weren't sent to the agoj, but you entered a state-supervised education system that was remarkably rigorous by ancient standards, not because Spartans valued women's equality, but because they understood that strong mothers produced strong warriors. Your physical training was extensive. You ran, wrestled, threw javelins, and participated in athletic competitions. This wasn't for your benefit, but to ensure you'd be physically capable of bearing healthy children. Spartan girls were famously athletic compared to women elsewhere in Greece, where upper-class women were often kept indoors and deliberately made weak. It was like being in a civilization where one city had discovered that women were humans with physical capabilities, except they discovered it for breeding purposes rather than human rights reasons. You trained partially clothed or even naked during some exercises which scandalized other Greeks, but which Spartans considered practical. Modesty was less important than physical conditioning. You weren't being sexualized. You were being prepared for your role as mother of warriors, and that role required physical strength. It was like discovering that one ancient society had accidentally stumbled onto women's sports, but for all the wrong reasons. Your education included some literacy and cultural training, more than girls received elsewhere in Greece. You learned to read and write, studied music and dance, and received education in Spartan values and history. This wasn't enlightened education for its own sake, Literate mothers could better educate young children, and culturally educated women could properly instill Spartan values in the next generation. It was education as preparation for motherhood rather than personal development. You were expected to be tough, outspoken, and fierce. Spartan women were famous throughout Greece for being assertive and bold, qualities that other Greeks found shocking or even shameful. You weren't taught to be demure or submissive. You were taught to be strong enough to bear and raise warriors. If your future husband came home from battle having shown cowardice, you were expected to shame him mercilessly. If your son died in combat, you were expected to express pride rather than grief. It was like growing up in a culture where toxic masculinity had infected the entire society, including women, who were expected to enforce it brutally. Marriage for you came relatively late compared to other Greek cities, around 18 rather than 13 or 14. This was practical policy. Girls who married too young often died in childbirth, and dead mothers couldn't produce warriors. The delay was about maximizing your reproductive success, not protecting your childhood. It was like discovering that one society accidentally delayed marriage for health reasons while still seeing women primarily as breeding stock. Your husband would be a Spartan warrior, possibly selected by you. Spartan women had more choice in marriage than women elsewhere. But he wouldn't live with you. He lived in military barracks until age 30, visiting occasionally for conjugal relations. You'd raise children largely without him, managing household and property independently. Spartan women had more autonomy than women elsewhere, specifically because men were busy with military duties. It was like being a single mother by design, where father absence was state policy. You owned property, managed estates, and had legal rights unusual for ancient Greek women. Not because Spartans were feminists, but because someone needed to manage things while men prepared for war. Spartan women controlled significant wealth, which gave them power, but always in service of supporting the military state. It was like economic empowerment that came with strings attached, where your power existed to support a system that still fundamentally valued you only for reproduction. The famous story of Spartan women telling departing warriors, "Come back with your shield or on it," meaning return victorious or dead, captures the expected maternal attitude. You weren't supposed to value your son's life over his honor. His death in battle should bring you pride. If he came home defeated, you should be ashamed. It was like having a mother who valued your military success over your actual survival, where maternal love was channeled entirely through supporting state military objectives. Some Spartan women became powerful figures, wealthy, influential, respected for producing warrior sons. Others lived in the constant grief of losing children to warfare, though they had to hide that grief because displaying it was considered weakness. You existed in a system that gave you more freedom than women elsewhere, but constrained that freedom within narrow, acceptable uses. It was like discovering that empowerment can come in forms that still fundamentally oppress. As our journey through Spartan childhood comes to an end, we need to confront what this system actually produced and what it cost. The Spartan educational system was successful in its stated goals. It produced fearless warriors who dominated Greek warfare for generations. Spartan soldiers were genuinely exceptional, and other Greek cities both feared and admired them. But that military excellence came at a cost that should make us question whether any achievement justifies such methods. The psychological damage was immense and permanent. You grew up in a system designed to suppress normal human emotion, to replace empathy with ruthlessness, to make you value state service over personal relationships. Some men emerged from the agage as exactly what Sparta wanted: hard, emotionless, effective warriors who felt nothing. Others were internally destroyed, maintaining facades of Spartan hardness while suffering trauma they could never express. A few maintained humanity despite everything, but they had to hide it. It was like producing soldiers who were technically effective but fundamentally damaged as human beings. The cost in human life was substantial. Children died during training, from beatings, from exposure, from malnutrition, from infections that their weakened bodies couldn't fight. More died during the cryptia, either as perpetrators killed by desperate helots or as victims of the system's violence. The infant exposure, whether common or rare, meant that some babies died for failing inspection, and countless helots died in the ongoing terrorism that Spartan education normalized and practiced. It was like discovering that a system's success was built on a foundation of corpses, most of them belonging to children or enslaved people. The social cost was profound. Spartan society was rigid, militaristic, and ultimately sterile. They produced no great art, no significant literature, no philosophical advances. Spartan contribution to human culture was almost entirely military. Their entire civilization was organized around warfare, and when they eventually lost military dominance, they had nothing else. It was like a civilization that put all its resources into one skill and neglected everything else that makes civilization worthwhile. The irony is that despite all this brutal conditioning, despite the systematic breaking and rebuilding of children into weapons, Sparta eventually fell. Their military dominance ended. Their system proved unsustainable. The helots they terrorized eventually were freed. The warriors they produced with such cruelty couldn't prevent Sparta's decline. All the suffering, all the brutality, all the childhood trauma, it bought temporary military advantage that eventually meant nothing. It was like discovering that enormous human cost produced only temporary benefits, and the long-term result was a civilization that contributed remarkably little to human progress. Modern society sometimes romanticizes Sparta, focusing on their military prowess while ignoring the systematic child abuse, the slavery, the murders, the utter disregard for human well-being in pursuit of military power. Movies show disciplined warriors standing in formation, but they don't show the starving 7-year-olds being beaten for getting caught stealing. They show heroic last stands, but they don't show the young men murdering enslaved farmers as part of their education. The romanticization erases the reality that Spartan military excellence was purchased through methods that we'd recognize as war crimes if practiced today. Some people point to Spartan discipline as admirable, to their toughness as exemplary, to their system as proof that hardship builds character. But this perspective ignores that you can build capable people without systematic abuse, that discipline doesn't require childhood starvation, that strength can be developed without breaking children first. The Spartan model proves only that humans can survive terrible conditions if forced to, not that terrible conditions are beneficial or necessary. Growing up in Sparta meant having your childhood stolen, replaced with training for state service. It meant being hungry most of the time, being cold or hot without adequate clothing, being beaten regularly, watching others die around you. It meant learning to value victory over safety, state over self, hardness over humanity. It meant becoming what your society demanded regardless of what you might have chosen for yourself. Some adapted and survived. Some thrived within the system. Most simply endured, and many didn't survive at all. Before we conclude, we need to examine what happened when you completed the agoge and what that completion actually meant. Surviving to age 20 was an achievement in itself. Many of your peers didn't make it. But graduation from the agoge didn't mean freedom or even the end of state control over your life. It meant transition from trainee to active warrior, from property being prepared to property being used. At 20, you became an iron yourself if selected, supervising younger boys, inflicting on them the same brutality you'd endured. This transition from victim to perpetrator was psychologically significant. You'd spent 13 years being beaten, starved, and controlled. Now you had power over others and permission to exercise it violently. Some young men embraced this power, becoming brutal trainers who exceeded even what they'd experienced. Others exercised authority reluctantly, remembering their own suffering. But regardless of personal feelings, you were expected to maintain the system, to produce the next generation of warriors through the same methods that had produced you. It was like escaping an abusive situation only to become the abuser yourself, perpetuating a cycle of trauma across generations. From 20 to 30, you lived in military barracks, the cessation, with other men, participating in communal meals and constant military readiness. You weren't allowed to live with your wife, even if you married during this period. You visited her secretly at night, sneaking out of the barracks for brief conjugal visits before returning. This wasn't romantic. It was state policy to ensure that male bonding and military focus remained primary. Your relationship with your wife was secondary to your relationships with fellow warriors. It was like forced separation designed to prevent emotional attachments that might compromise military loyalty. The famous Spartan communal meals you now attended weren't pleasant dining experiences. They were extensions of the agoge's terrible food policy. You contributed food from your land allocation, but the meals remained deliberately unappetizing. The black broth continued. The emphasis remained on utility rather than enjoyment. You'd escape childhood starvation only to face adult mandatory bad food. It was like discovering that graduation from hell meant advancement to a slightly better but still terrible circle of hell. Military service was constant expectation. Sparta was frequently at war, and you'd participate in campaigns regularly. The actual combat you'd trained for since age 7 finally became reality. Some men found that war was less terrible than training. At least in war, enemies fought back, but you had purpose beyond simply enduring. Others discovered that actual combat was worse than training. People really died, wounds really hurt, and fear was constant despite all the conditioning. It was like preparing your entire life for a job and then discovering the job was both better and worse than training suggested. The battles you fought weren't the heroic last stands Hollywood show. Most were grinding campaigns of attrition, sieges lasting months, raids on enemy territory, and political conflicts where you were the enforcer. You killed people, saw friends die, and carried out policies that included destroying cities, killing prisoners, and terrorizing populations. Your training had prepared you to kill efficiently, but hadn't prepared you for the moral weight of doing so repeatedly. Some men became emotionally numb. Others privately struggled with guilt they could never express. It was like discovering that being good at violence didn't make violence easier to live with psychologically. At 30, you finally achieved full citizenship and were allowed to live in your own home with your family. But freedom at 30 meant you'd spent 23 years under direct state control. Your entire childhood and young adulthood shaped by Spartan military education. The person who finally got to live independently was so thoroughly conditioned by the system that true independence was probably impossible. You'd internalized Spartan values so completely that questioning them would have been mentally difficult or impossible. It was like achieving freedom after decades of conditioning that made you incapable of using freedom in ways the system wouldn't approve. Even after 30, military service continued. You trained regularly, participated in campaigns when called, and remained part of Sparta's military infrastructure until age 60. The agoge wasn't preparation for a military career, it was preparation for a military life that lasted 40 years. You were a soldier from age 7 to 60, with different levels of activity, but never truly civilian. It was like being drafted at 7 and never being discharged. Your entire adult life defined by military service, the state demanded. If you survived to old age, and many didn't, given the constant warfare and harsh conditions, you finally achieved some status and respect. The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, held real political power. But to reach that point, you'd survived decades of the hardest life ancient Greece could inflict. You'd endured childhood brutality, adolescent starvation, young adult warfare, and middle-aged combat stress. The few who made it to honored old age had survived conditions that killed most of their peers. It was like a retirement plan, where the retirement age was 60, and most people died before reaching it. But those who survived were finally valued. Throughout all of this, the threat of losing citizenship hung over you. If you couldn't contribute to the communal meals, if you showed cowardice in battle, if you failed to maintain expected standards, you could be demoted from full citizen to inferior status. This social death meant losing political rights, being excluded from the warrior class, becoming a second-class person in a society that valued only military contribution. The fear of this fate motivated constant performance, constant vigilance, constant adherence to Spartan norms. It was like having a job where poor performance meant not getting fired, but being permanently marked as a failure everyone could see. The economic system supporting all this was built on helot slavery. The agricultural labor that fed you, the surplus that allowed you to be a full-time warrior rather than a farmer, the wealth that made Spartan military focus possible, all of it came from enslaved people working land you nominally owned, but they actually farmed. Your entire lifestyle was built on their exploitation, maintained through the terrorism you'd been trained to inflict. It was like discovering your privileged position was built on systematic oppression, and your education had specifically prepared you to perpetuate that oppression through violence. The Spartan system created men who were militarily effective, but often emotionally damaged, socially rigid, and culturally sterile. You might be an excellent warrior, but you probably couldn't write poetry, create art, or contribute to philosophy. You'd been so specialized in warfare that you'd been made deliberately ignorant of everything else. Sparta produced the best infantry in Greece, but contributed remarkably little to Greek civilization in other areas. It was like being trained so thoroughly in one skill that you became useless for everything else. The relationships you formed were deep but constrained. Your bonds with fellow warriors were intense. You'd trained together, fought together, depended on each other for survival, but these relationships existed within rigid parameters defined by Spartan masculinity norms. You couldn't show weakness, couldn't express fear, couldn't admit uncertainty. Even your closest friendships operated within emotional constraints that prevented true vulnerability. It was like having close relationships that could never be fully honest, because honesty about feelings was forbidden. Some scholars argue that the agoge created homosexual bonds between older and younger men, that the Aaron mentored younger boys in relationships that included sexual components. Historical evidence is ambiguous, but if such relationships existed, they occurred within the power dynamics of the system, where the younger partner had no real agency to consent or refuse. Whether or not sexual relationships were normative, the emotional intensity and physical intimacy of the all-male environment certainly created complex relationships that don't fit modern categories easily. It was like growing up in circumstances where normal relationship boundaries were unclear and power dynamics complicated all connections. Looking at the full arc of a Spartan life, from inspection at birth through old age, the system reveals itself as totalizing control. The state owned you from birth, shaped you from age 7, used you from age 20, and might finally grant you some autonomy and respect at 60 if you survived that long. Your entire existence was organized around military utility, personal happiness, individual desires, emotional needs. None of that mattered compared to your function as a warrior. It was like being born into a machine designed to process children into soldiers, where the machine's efficiency was valued infinitely more than the well-being of the humans being processed. The ultimate irony is that all this brutality, all this suffering, all this careful cultivation of military excellence ultimately failed to preserve Sparta. By the 4th century BC, Spartan power was declining. Their rigid system couldn't adapt to changing military tactics. Their population of full citizens was shrinking. The harsh conditions, the constant warfare, and the strict requirements meant fewer people could maintain full citizenship. Their oppressed helots eventually gained freedom not through Spartan mercy, but through Spartan weakness and outside intervention. The system that had brutalized generations of children for military power eventually failed in its primary objective, maintaining that power. It was like discovering that enormous human cost purchased temporary advantage that couldn't be sustained, and the long-term result was failure of the very system the suffering was meant to support. The next time someone praises Spartan discipline or holds up their education system as admirable, remember what that system actually entailed. Remember the children being beaten at the altar while tourists watched. Remember the systematic starvation. Remember the murders of enslaved people as educational exercise. Remember that military effectiveness achieved through systematic abuse of children isn't admirable, it's horrifying, and the horror isn't erased by the effectiveness. Sparta's experiment in creating perfect warriors through childhood brutality proved that you could break humans and rebuild them as weapons. But it also proved that such weapons are still broken humans, that the cost was enormous, that the benefits were temporary, and that a civilization built entirely around warfare ultimately contributes little to human culture beyond cautionary examples of how wrong education can go when military utility becomes the only value. The Spartan model should be studied not as an inspiration, but as a warning, a demonstration of how far human societies can go in sacrificing individual well-being for collective military power, and how such sacrifices ultimately fail to produce lasting benefits that justify the cost. The broken children, the traumatized adults, the dead helots, the sterile culture. These are the real legacy of Sparta, far more significant than their temporary military dominance. Every element of the Spartan system was calculated to achieve one goal: producing warriors who would fight effectively and without question. The infant inspection, the early hardening, the agoges brutality, the systematic starvation, the violent competitions, the cryptia murders, the lifelong military service, every piece fit together as a comprehensive program for breaking and rebuilding humans. And it worked, in the narrow sense that it produced militarily effective soldiers. But it failed in the broader sense that it created a civilization that couldn't sustain itself, that contributed little to human culture, and that caused enormous suffering for questionable long-term benefit. The cost-benefit analysis, when honestly calculated, shows that Sparta's methods produced far more human misery than they generated lasting value. And so ends our journey through growing up in ancient Sparta. If you enjoyed this confrontation with difficult historical reality, subscribe for more explorations into the truth behind historical myths. Let me know in the comments which aspect of Spartan childhood was most shocking to you, or which other historical topic you'd like us to explore. Rest well, time traveler, and perhaps appreciate that you grew up in a time and place where childhood is valued, where children aren't systematically starved, where being a child is allowed before you're forced to become an adult. The contrast makes your own childhood, whatever its challenges, look dramatically better by comparison. Sweet dreams!